Chapter 12. The dream visit of our grandfather has helped my brother focus on the slaying of the monster. He thinks he is returning to the battle. What he does not know is that even if he had not returned, the battle would have come to him. The monster and the monster slayer both search for each other from the moment of their births. It is the way of things. Sheriff Bogle had served as a New Mexico law officer for over 20 years, starting as a deputy right out of college and working his way up. He stood just over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a disposition that made him laugh at troubles before he got angry at them. Everyone in the county knew him and liked him, and no one gave him any problems. They all knew that under the broad smile, the weathered face and twinkling eyes, hid the sting of a scorpion. But the scorpion wasn't hiding today. He'd already had a hell of a morning. After the army had announced that the earthquake everyone had felt the day before had actually been an explosion that destroyed Cole Army Base in the next county, his county had gone crazy. Everyone who could was getting into cars, jeeps, and rusted pickups, packing all they had, and was getting out of town. He'd never seen a traffic jam in Agot before, but he'd had to deal with one for most of the day. He wasn't sure what they were afraid of. If there had been fallout from the explosion, the army would have issued warnings already, and no one had. If there were going to be more explosions, they would be in the vicinity of the army base, not in Agot. But he couldn't explain that to anyone. No one wanted to hear logic. Of course, he had to think logically, because he had to stay. It was his job to serve and protect, and he was doing it. If he had children, though, or his wife hadn't decided that rural New Mexico was too primitive for her, he would be shipping them out just as fast as he could. Hell, if the truth be told, he was jealous of the folks who had the ability to leave. He didn't, and neither did half of the town. Those who couldn't leave were watching the traffic jam with 2 parts envy and 1 part amusement. They stood in the doorways of their businesses, arms crossed, and made rude jokes, or catcalled the occasional fender bender. Not one of them went into the street to help, and that was damned unusual. In the past, the locals had gone out of their way to help each other. The only one who wasn't outside was Ben. He was sitting on the wrong side of his bar, sampling the wares. When Bogle had asked him if everything was all right, he had replied, "The army says so. Why should I doubt them?" Why indeed? Bogle was asking himself just that question when the second oddity of the day occurred. The dispatch hailed him with news of a double murder at the Nayenezgani place out on the old highway. Nayenezgani was one of a dozen sheep herders who managed to stay alive in this area, spreading their flocks out over hundreds of acres of high desert to get them enough food. None of them, or their kids, had ever given him a whisper of trouble. There had never been petty theft or school-age pranks, or even foul language from those families. He couldn't imagine how murder could occur up there. Bogle had left 2 deputies in charge of making sure nothing got looted in town as everyone left, then picked up Dr. Ellison to head out to investigate. Ellison had been the county's only doctor for the last 15 years. Everyone called him Pro instead of Doc because of his early days as a professional golfer. There wasn't a golf course within 50 miles of Agot, New Mexico, and Pro said he liked it just fine that way. From what the sheriff understood, Pro had given up golf after he broke just about all his clubs in a bad round during a Phoenix tournament. But in 15 years he'd never heard Pro talk about that tournament or why he'd moved to Agot. Pro still half looked like a golf professional. He always wore stylish, short-sleeved shirts and slacks, and was very seldom seen without a golf hat on, even in the small county hospital. Despite his always looking so out of place, everyone in the county had grown to love him and his easy smile. Sheriff Bogle considered him more than a friend. The Pro was almost a partner in taking care of the county and its residents. The 15-minute ride out of the old highway in the sheriff's jeep was mostly silent. The warm morning air was swirling around the two men, both lost in their thoughts of losing Cole Army Base and facing a double murder scene. Everything in their world had suddenly changed. It wasn't the sort of day for small talk. The closer they got to the Nadia stake, the more Bogle dreaded it. He was beginning to wish he had never gotten up that morning. Finally, he saw the Nadia place on the side of the road. Nothing looked out of place. If he had been passing by, he wouldn't have noticed a thing. Bogle slid the jeep to a stop in the dirt of the Nadia driveway. "Dan's truck?" Pro asked, pointing at the pickup parked in front of them. "Yeah," Bogle replied. He didn't like the fact that Dan Bonner might be mixed up in this. Dan was one of the nicest people working for the big companies. He actually cared for these ranchers and the herders in this area. Walking Dove Nadia came slowly out the front door to greet them. She looked slumped over, as if simply standing was too much pain to endure. Normally, she was a proud woman in her mid-40s who had raised her children to walk proud also. Now her weathered face was stained with tears and her eyes were empty. "Back there," she said softly as Pro jumped out of the jeep and moved to her. "Back there." She was pointing to an area behind the house where the sheep were held. "Can you tell me what happened?" Bogle asked. He didn't want to go barging around back there if the murderer might still be there, waiting to gun them down. "She's in shock," Pro said, steadying her with a firm hand. Walking Dove shook her head from side to side, the tears flowing freely now. "I don't know," she said. Billy saw everything." "Billy?" Bogle asked. "Their youngest son," Pro said. "About 6, sharp kid." "Where is Billy?" Bogle asked. "Inside," Walking Dove said softly. At that moment, a young child opened the screen door and stepped outside, letting the door bang close behind him. The sound echoed over the surrounding desert and was carried away by the warm wind. Billy wore a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles t-shirt and stained jeans. He too had been crying, but at that moment he was trying to repress the tears. His eyes weren't empty. Instead, they had the 1,000-yard stare that Bogle had seen countless times before, always on the faces of the vets who found refuge out here in the desert. Vets who had seen the worst of combat, whether in Korea, Vietnam, or the Gulf. Bogle walked up the porch steps slowly, knowing that if he moved too quickly, the boy would bolt. Bogle waited until he had reached the boy's side, before crouching, so that he would be at the boy's eye level. "Billy," Bogle said, making sure he didn't patronize the kid. He was talking as one adult to another now, and he felt that would keep the kid calm. "Can you tell me what happened?" Billy nodded, but kept his mouth closed. Obviously this wasn't going to be easy. "What did you see?" Bogle asked, lowering his voice just a little, as if they were having an intimate conversation. The boy blinked once, then said, "Blue fire." "Blue fire," Bogle repeated stupidly. He couldn't think what that meant. Billy nodded again. "Just blue fire." His voice broke. He cleared his throat, just like a man would do, and said, "There was blue fire, and then Daddy was dead." Bogle glanced up at Pro, who only shrugged. "Did you see what caused the blue fire?" Bogle asked. Billy shook his head. "Blue fire," Bogle repeated, more to himself than anyone else. "And blood," the little boy said. The calm in his tone made Bogle shudder. "Lots of blood." Bogle put a reassuring hand on the kid's shoulder, but he didn't know what to say. Even though he had been sheriff for a long time, he'd never spoken to a child who had just seen his father murdered. It would take a lot more time and effort to get a clearer picture from the boy. Bogle took a deep breath. Whatever had caused that blue fire had to be long gone. It had taken him time to get here, and time must have elapsed before the dispatch took the call. But it was better to take precautions. The sheriff squeezed Billy's shoulder. "You stay out here with your mother." Billy nodded. Then Bogle stood and unhooked the leather strap over his revolver. "Come on, Pro. Let's go take a look." Pro gently patted Walking Dove's shoulder, then moved in behind Bogle as they headed past Dan's truck and towards the sheep pens. It was instantly clear that something truly grisly had happened behind this herder's house. Blood was sprayed everywhere over the wooden sheep pen. It stained the dirt brown like raindrops. Human skin and intestines dripped from a nearby sage. Even the remaining sheep in the pen had been splattered with blood and human skin. What was left of Nadia's and Dan's bodies were just a few steps away from the pen. It was clear they had died almost instantly, literally blown apart by some intense force or weapon. That blue fire of Billy's was powerful stuff. Bogle felt as if his stomach might give back the greasy breakfast he'd had a few hours before. In all his years, he'd seen a lot of death, but nothing like this. Bogle stopped a short distance from the bodies and held out his hand to stop Pro. "There's nothing you can do to help them," he said. "Let's not go messing up what evidence there is." Pro only nodded, swallowing hard. It was clear to Bogle that even the doctor was sickened by this sight. Anyone would be. "What kind of weapon could do this?" Pro asked. "Not any weapon I'm familiar with," Bogle said. "I don't think it was a gun. I've never seen bullets do this kind of damage, not even a lot of them. If I didn't know better, I would say it was an explosion, but there's no blast site." "Well, if it wasn't a gun or a bomb," Pro said, "then what was it?" A faint whirring filled the air, as if dozens of insects were swarming close by. "You hear that?" Bogle asked. "Yeah," Pro said. "Sounds like..." Suddenly, a red rope seemed to wrap around Pro's chest, as if he'd been lassoed 15 times. There was an intense crackle, like electricity popping in a loose wire, and then Bogle heard the sizzle of flesh burning. The ropes were turning blue. Blue energy. Blue fire. Pro let out a gagging cough as his eyes burst from their sockets, spraying blood over Bogle like someone had turned on 2 fire hoses. Pro was dead before his body hit the ground. His arms melted into the side of his body, smoke pouring from his mouth and nose. The stink of burning flesh filled the air. Bogle had his gun in his hands and was spinning around, looking for who or what had attacked his friend. His heart was pounding. Who'd have thought the killer would still be here? After all, the wife and kid were still alive. Didn't it know they were there? Or was it guarding the sheep pen? He kept turning. There didn't seem to be anything or anyone around. Only the shimmering of the air between him and the house, like heat coming off the ground. But at that moment, Bogle didn't feel much like waiting for a clear shot. It wasn't hot enough for the ground to be radiating heat waves, and in Bogle's mind, that meant that whatever had killed Pro had something to do with the shimmer. He opened fire, spraying the area with shot after shot from his .357 Magnum. And he hit nothing. Or at least it seemed like nothing, until a hideous roar filled the air. Green liquid was spraying out in all directions. Bogle had hit something after all. Only he couldn't believe what he was seeing. A monster shimmered into view, holding its arm. A creature with long, beaded hair and strange armor now faced him, holding one arm. It was big, bigger than anything he'd ever seen that stood on 2 legs. Suddenly, 3 red lights focused on Bogle's chest. He tried to move away, But before he could, a blue bolt of energy surged from a device beside the monster's ear. It hit Bogle instantly and sent him flying backward, his entire chest and stomach spraying out over the nearby brush and sheep, mixing with the blood of Nadia, Dan Bonney, and Dr. Ellison. Bogle would never know exactly how much he had hurt the alien, but 3 of his shots had been lucky, destroying part of the alien's armor and ripping through his skin and arm. It would slow the alien down for just long enough to save a few lives. The alien moved over to Bogle's body, reached down, and with a quick swipe of the wrist blade, severed the man's head from his body. Then, hanging the sheriff's head on his belt, he turned and moved off into the desert, green blood dripping from his wounds.